Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this podcast topic is Army operations in maritime environments, focusing on Chapter 7 of FM 30. We welcome General Charles Flynn, Commanding General of the United States Army Pacific, or USARPAC, and Colonel Retired Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
We recently celebrated the 80th anniversary of D-Day, paying tribute to the Americans and allies that executed combat operations within the maritime and land domains. And closer to home, we recently talked about the maritime domain on our podcast. We centered our conversation on Army watercraft. Today, I'd like to focus on the Indo-Pacific theater and talk about the U.S. Army's contribution to operations in the maritime domain. I'd first like to start our conversation by going back to World War II, but focusing on the Pacific theater. So, Mr. Creed, could you help us understand the historical impact of Army operations in the maritime domain?
Yeah, sure thing, Lisa. And sir, you've heard a lot of this stuff before. I know you use it in your engagements, and I will tell you that every time I brief FM 30 to audiences, particularly to our general officers, I refer to a bunch of facts that we found in John C. McManus's trilogy on the role of Army forces, the campaigns they fought in the Pacific in the Second World War. And we recommend that trilogy to every audience that we engage because, one, it's really well written, and two, it's kind of unusual in that it is focused on Army forces because of the popular perception that, you know, that was a Marine Corps Navy campaign. And in the first of his books in the trilogy is called Fire and Fortitude, that kind of lays the ground in the introduction and then talks about the first part of the war. Here are some of the facts that came out or that he published in that book. The first is he talks about the Marine Corps making 15 amphibious combat landings over the course of the war in the Pacific. And he contrasts that with the spring of 1945 when General Eichelberger's 8th U.S. Army conducted 35 amphibious landings over a 5-week period. Army forces conducted 370 amphibious operations during the war, including at least 6 major ones in the European theater. So while the U.S. Marine Corps fought with 6 divisions and about 250,000 Marines, all of which were fully dependent on the Navy and the Army for their logistical support, they performed heroically, of course, in some of the highest profile battles of the war. And the popular media tended to celebrate those victories, and rightly so. But it came in some ways at the expense of advertising or celebrating the role of Army forces during those campaigns. The Army deployed 21 divisions, infantry and airborne, plus several more regimental combat teams, and a host of tank battalions that essentially equated to 3 additional divisions worth of combat power. So 24 total division formation equivalents, and that's not counting the enormous logistical transportation, anti-aircraft intelligence, medical and engineering responsibilities that enabled the entire joint force at the time during those campaigns. And they lasted from the beginning of the war all the way to the very end when the peace treaty was signed. By the summer of 1945, there were 1.8 million Army soldiers, not counting the Army Air Corps, serving in the Pacific or on mainland Asia. It was the 3rd largest land force we've ever fielded in U.S. history, after the ones fielded in Europe in the Second World War and Europe in the First World War. Even when you think about airborne operations, you've got the 82nd, 101st, and 17th Airborne in Europe. But really, a lot of folks, particularly historians, view the operations, the airborne operations of the 11th Airborne Division as the gold standard in terms of quantity of jumps, accuracy, survival rates, and so forth. So there may be some things you want to add to that, sir, but I'll tell you, we use Mr. McManus's books as a reference because I think it's a powerful testimony.
Well, Rich, John McManus has been to the command a couple of times. He is a extraordinary historian, and I could not agree with you more on his books, particularly Fire and Fortitude. So I'm glad that we're going back over that with our students and talking about it. And so, and much of what you pointed out was incredibly important. And also, just when you think about the enormity and the sacrifices there. And while you did celebrate the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which was the largest amphibious operation in history, the Army's achievements, I guess, in Europe, they're absolutely colossal. But I'll point out that D-Day, at the time, eclipsed the largest amphibious operation up until that point, which happened just a few months earlier in an operation called Operation Flintlock, where Army and Marine forces seized the Marshall Islands in January, February 1944. In fact, 7th Infantry Division fought at a place called Rhinamore, which is an island feature in the Marshall Islands, not far from Kwajalein. And that seizure of the Marshall Islands led to several critical events throughout the war. And it's timely to mention these events because other notable Pacific operations are approaching their 80th anniversaries soon, next year, in fact. So a couple of points. The battle to retake Guam, Tinian, and Saipan in the Northern Marianas, another sizable amphibious operation that secured vital terrain and airfields to launch further bombing missions to the Japanese homeland, including the atomic missions. That all came as a result of those amphibious operations that springed us and U.S. forces free once we seized the Marshall Islands. Of note, the Guam anniversary that's coming up represents the last time U.S. soldiers battled to retake and return U.S. sovereign soil that was seized by a foreign invader. And soon, of course, in the Philippines, we're going to celebrate General MacArthur's return, including the famous landings at Leyte and the liberation of Manila. And I'll just point out at this point that the Army did more amphibious operations in the Philippines alone than the Marines did throughout the entire course of the war. Finally, next year in April, we'll celebrate the Battle of Okinawa. Again, back to some of the history here and maybe some of the myths, but that was the largest and bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific. And I'll note it was an Army-led operation with 10th Field Army, consisting of 24th Corps and 4 divisions. The 7th Division, 27th Division, 77th Division, and the 96th Division. And then, of course, there was an amphibious group and 3 Marine Corps divisions. And that joint force fought, and estimates are that there were nearly 100,000 U.S. casualties and about 150,000 Japanese casualties. Now, there are also enormous sacrifices on the part of the Okinawan civilians that lived in that area as well. And I mention all of this because the Army has a long and storied history in the Pacific. It's important we not only honor our soldiers' legacy, but we have to learn and apply these lessons of our past to our challenges and the opportunities in the contemporary environment that we're facing today. And again, while a lot has changed out here, the geometry of this geography has not changed. And so adapting the Army and the range and network of what I refer to as the strategic land power network is vitally important to our success here in the region. Thanks.
Oh, yes, sir. That strategic land power network, we've actually managed to work that into doctrine. If you remember back about 10 years, we talked about it when we had a strategic land power office, TRADOC ran. And we don't have that anymore, but I think in many ways you're single-handedly performing that role of reinvigorating that idea because it's hugely important. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that's hugely important is that when we talk about campaigns and campaigning, those are joint endeavors. And there's a role of land forces in terms of enabling the other components of the joint force. A lot of those islands, those battles were fought over control of land masses that were then used to enable operational depth for the rest of the joint force. So I think that's a big deal. And I think that's another one of those things that's enduring.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And the way to get that bound together, the way to galvanize that strategic land power network is with U.S. leadership. And it's just a stark reminder to all those that they look at the map and there's a lot of blue and there's, this long-held view that we can solve the problem out here with naval and air power. And while naval and air power is incredibly important to keeping the global commons open, land forces and the strategic land power network is really the central institution in all of these countries that they turn to defend their territorial integrity, protect their people, and protect their national sovereignty. And that, to me, is the value of the land forces out here, and the interdependencies of the joint force make the Army and the land power network here central to success.
Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, thanks for showing us that rich history, and how important the Army is in the Pacific. I think we could probably spend the whole episode on lessons learned. And General Flynn, I hope we'll talk about allies and partners a little bit later in the episode. But let's fast forward about 70 years to 2012. The U.S. military was focused on Central Command, CENTCOM, and the U.S. Army was fighting the war in Afghanistan, and it soon re-entered Iraq. At the same time, President Obama began messaging a shift from CENTCOM to a rebalance in Asia and the Pacific. This shift was widely known as the Pacific Pivot. General Flynn, I'm going to kind of go through your resume for our listeners. You served as the 25th Infantry Division Commanding General and Deputy Commanding General USARPAC from 2014 to 2018. And then 3 years later, you were back as the Commanding General of USARPAC. So I'm curious, how have you seen the Pacific Pivot evolve since 2012 or 2014 when you got there? And how have you seen the Army's focus change?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I guess what I would say is you're right. You point out the Pacific Pivot, but maybe I guess at the time when I arrived in 2014, I'll just rattle off a couple of things that the Army did. The first thing that the Army did, this was back when, bless his soul, General Odierno was the Chief of Army, that they took the 4-star billet that the Army owned from Europe and they put it in the Pacific. And first, I'll say modern era commander of U.S. Army Pacific during this pivot to the Pacific was General Vince Brooks. But maybe more importantly than that, they also increased the flag officer members of this headquarters. And the other part that is not well understood was they assigned more forces to U.S. INDOPACOM in the Forces 4 document and in the global management guidance based on the National Defense Strategy. The other thing that happened, and now I'm coming into 2014 when I arrived, because I took command in April of 14. So General Brooks was about a year plus into the new era of command. The other thing that happened was the Army took assigned forces in the Pacific off what was called the patch chart, CENTCOM. And those things combined were additive to land forces in the Pacific. So you scale up the command and control capabilities, you scale up the amount of forces assigned, and then you decide to not place those forces into the Middle East in order to keep more capabilities in the Pacific. And I think all of that gave a sense of purpose and a renewed sense of urgency, if you will, based on the threat. Now, one other, I'll say, operational matter that occurred at that time, which is still, part of our operational design here in the Indo-Pacific, is General Brooks scratched out on a piece of paper to me. Actually, was in his office when I first arrived, about what he wanted the command, the 25th Infantry Division, to do for Pacific Pathways. And basically his idea was get Army forces in motion west of the international date line and stay there, tie together 3 exercises in 3 months, and create a presence forward. So when I look back on that effort, and then the command and control increase, the sum total of the forces increased, and then the staying power of land forces in the Pacific. And then I go forward to my time as the DCG, and then I go forward to my time here as the commanding general. Pacific Pathways has evolved into Operation Pathways, which is now tying together the more than 40 Army-to-Army and joint exercises that we do out here as one of the ways that we support the INDOPACOM theater campaign, and also one of the ways that we support the National Defense Strategy. So, I could talk for an hour on this alone. I guess the other aspect is that the potential adversaries are changing, and they're changing rapidly. So, 2015, 2016, the modernization and the reorganization of the PLA took root. That all kind of caught up with one another. And at the same time, they began to create their own, taking a page out of our book, their own training centers and large-scale training, joint training exercises. So they, our adversary, have been reorganizing, modernizing, training, and increasing their joint exercises and adding complexity and adding capabilities to it. And then you throw in the connection between the DPRK threat, the Chinese threat, and now today the Russian threat, and you can see where our operations absolutely have to be oriented on the threats.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because that's about the same time, 2016, 17, where we were given permission to shift our doctrine to a threat-oriented posture as opposed to just talking about our own capabilities.
Speaking of doctrine, this is the breaking doctrine. So I do need to shift over to a little bit of doctrine. So let's look at FM30. Now, unlike previous versions, the 2022 edition of 30 has a whole chapter dedicated to operations in the maritime environment. So that's chapter 7. So, Mr. Creed, could you guys give us a peek behind the scenes on why that chapter 7 was included?
Yeah, sure. I think I first need to link this part of our chat to the sense of urgency that General Flynn mentioned earlier. So in 2017, we shifted our operational focus, our readiness focus in the Army for being prepared for large-scale conventional conflict or large-scale combat operations against capable threats. And we named names, as we just mentioned, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. But that was just a first step. It was really trying to represent a cultural shift. And it wasn't a whole lot of new thinking. It was a lot of adjusting some old ideas for the current operational environment. But when we got to the guidance to, hey, we need to update this book, and we want to release it in 2022, nobody really told us anything other than to put multi-domain operations and move it from the concept realm to the doctrine realm. But we, in our discussions with General Rainey, who was the Combined Arms Center commander at the time, It was our idea. Nobody told us to do this. It was our idea, again, based on that sense of urgency, that we needed to address what's different about conducting operations in a theater that is not entirely composed or mostly composed of land. So we, as an Army, we've been focused in Europe, Korean Peninsula, CENTCOM area of operations for pretty much most of the time since the Second World War. And our doctrine reflected that. You know, we didn't have a lot of considerations for what would be different if you had to campaign in a place like the INDOPACOM area of operations. And we needed to get these discussions on the table because doctrine drives a lot of other things, or it can drive a lot of other things. So if you start talking about the kinds of things that you expect Army forces to do, that Army forces need to be able to do in a theater like INDOPACOM, and by the way, the chapter applies to the Arctic and any other place where you would be conducting operations in the littorals or on islands. That would drive change across the Army in terms of how we think about modernization, our organizations, training and leader development, and so forth. So it's still a work in progress because this chapter was a first step. And so future iterations of this will get better, we think, because of all the things that USERPAC has been learning as it does Operation Pathways. The other thing I think that's important is we needed to rekindle a conversation with the U.S. Joint Force. So we've got all kinds of connective tissue with the U.S. Air Force in terms of air-ground integration. And that goes back to Cold War days. You know, we have battlefield coordinating detachments in the air operations centers in our theaters. We've got tactical air control parties embedded at Echelon. We have liaisons with the Air Force. We're tied in closely in the schoolhouses and so forth. We don't have that same kind of relationship institutionally with the U.S. Navy. And so we needed to put a marker on the table to drive a relationship with the U.S. Navy that closely approximates the relationship we have with the U.S. Air Force. And that's going to take a little bit of time. But, you know, that's why we started advocating for some sort of battlefield coordinating detachment or coordination detachment, like a BCD, in the Maritime Operations Center. And, you know, why couldn't we do that in INDOPACOM as a pilot or something like that? But all of those ideas were in the back of our heads as we were working through this chapter.
Could you also include some of the highlights that readers or listeners should take away from Chapter 7?
Okay, so yeah, so the first one is when we talk about the maritime domain, you have to remind people what the maritime domain is. It's not just the water. The joint definition, it encompasses the coastlines, islands, and littorals in a close by, you know, either in the ocean or a sea or close in close proximity to large bodies of water. So first we had to introduce the idea, then we needed to talk about what was different. And so there's a very joint flavor to this because land forces, and to a certain extent, some aspects of air forces even, are heavily dependent upon ships for resupply and logistics and so forth when you have to move masses of material somewhere. And so you had to think about planning differently. You need to think about where you were planning. You could have a division staff integrated into a JTF aboard a command ship, for example, in the Navy. We need to think about the operational framework differently. You know, you have deep, close rear support areas. That looks very different in a theater like INDOPACOM, where you're operating off a coast or in a littoral region, say an archipelago like the Philippines, for example. How do you position forces? How do you think about things that ordinarily you go RSOI, right? Reception, staging, onward movement, integration. You know, you might have to flip integration and onward movement when you're talking about a theater like INDOPACOM, because once you get to where you're going right into the fight. So you've got to be ready to go before you get there, much like airborne forces have traditionally had to do things. The other big idea we needed to do, and I know this is something that I think we stole from General Flynn, we certainly borrowed, was, if the U.S. Joint Force is fighting someplace like INDOPACOM, what's the purpose of those operations ultimately, right? I mean, we've got these go-to-war treaty allies, the majority of which are in INDOPACOM. What are we defending? What are we attacking to secure? And it's really about allies, populations, resources, joint infrastructure, as we discussed earlier. And then to General Flynn's point, projecting the joint force is a lot easier when you have some land masses to do that from, as opposed to having to fly, for example, across the entire Pacific Ocean to strike targets, right? And that campaigning in the Second World War was really about moving, seizing bases so that you could project joint combat power without having to fall back great distances to replenish. And so your sortie rates, both for naval forces and air forces, can increase if your basing is a little bit closer to where you want to fight. And you need land forces to be able to do those things. And it's not just the fighting piece, it's also the enabling piece that those factoids we talked about, referring to Mr. McManus's books. The basing, the engineering, and just the logistics aspect of that is enormous. And only the Army has certain capabilities to do those things like watercraft, J-lots, and so forth. So that's where we were coming from. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, sir.
Oh, I got a ton. Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I often say, and I know Rich has heard me say this before, I used to talk about it quite a bit when I was at G3 as well, as that, doctrine and the D in DOTML PFP is the first among equals, because from that, you're actually bringing together concepts, capabilities, and then all the other things that have to be synchronized to create an effective fighting force and like real operational capability. So I think the work that Rich just laid out there on creating Chapter 7 in FM30 was really both eye-opening but groundbreaking at the same time, because it was a recognition by our new doctrine that that land power plays an important role and the Army plays an important role in the maritime environment. And one point that I'll just zero in on is actually the chapter, and Rich touched on it, it talked about how key terrain matters. And that terrain allows you to do things like sea control, sea denial, project forces, integrate forces, generate forces, and that land forces being able to seize that terrain, hold it, and then use it to support allies and partners and to support our own security interests. And I'll remind everyone that, the U.S. has homelands in the Pacific. So, I say often that America's day begins in Guam, in the second island chain. And as I mentioned earlier in the historical comments that I made, the operations in the Marshall Islands allowed the U.S. to project power deeper into the Pacific. So while that history is important for us to look back on, it also rings true today. One other comment that I'll make, and I'll come back to a point that was made at the Land Forces of the Pacific Conference in May of 2016 that I was at, by then PACOM Commander Admiral Harry Harris. He actually said he needs Army forces to do the four following things: neutralize satellites, shoot down missiles, deny the enemy the ability to command and control. In other words, hack and jam their C2. Now, and then he also added sink ships. So 3 of the 4 we could do then, but we could not sink ships. And that, I think, along with the doctrine and Chapter 7, have created opportunities for us to envision in the Army how land forces in a maritime environment must be able to operate and fight. So let me talk a couple of warfighting functions to just give you a couple of thoughts. Command and control. So the Army, and really this is at the operational level with the theater army and field armies, and then with corps and divisions, we can provide command and control at scale and at echelon because we can be joint, multinational, and interagency and combined literally overnight. I mean, our scale is unmatched in the joint force. And we can do a range of operations. We can command and control a range of operations from humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, peacekeeping operations, all the way to war, large-scale war. So, C2 is just an amazing capability on the part of land forces. Collection or intelligence and information sharing agreements that expand our ability to see sense and make sense of what's actually happening out here. We can do that in the air littorals, in the maritime littorals, and do it obviously on the land with our vast collection network and our human network, which is so critical for our ability to actually see out here. Protection. Unbelievable progress being made in integrated air and missile defense, engineering for mobility, counter-mobility, survivability, and then I'll come back even to a short-range air defense, the SHORAD efforts that are underway for the Army. I think the integrated air and missile defense with IBCS, LTAMS, IFPC, the integration of Patriot and THAAD and the radars to do both offense, defense, and cueing to conduct counterfires is really, really important. Sustainment, everything from the watercraft, but also our traditional Army preposition stocks, but now what we're putting in place is a more distributed and dispersed set of what we refer to as joint theater distribution centers. And those joint theater distribution centers are sort of 21st century Army sustainment forward in small packages that we're constantly turning over with a set of equipment, but also sets of commodities that we can use while training, exercising, or in the event of a crisis or conflict. Fires, another great one. I think the multi-domain task force that really came out of the doctrine and the concept before that Rich was referring to, that organizational change tied to other organizational changes like the Theater Fires Element, the Theater Information Advantage Directorate, the Theater Strike Effects Groups, along with the mid-range capability of Typhoon, hypersonic capabilities and batteries, space capabilities, both light form factors and packages, electronic warfare, and other long-range precision fires that are in the inventory now with enhanced munitions. And then maneuver, tailoring our maneuver forces out here. I already talked about command and control, but I just used the 25th and the 11th Airborne Division. Those forces are tailored because they're in the environment and in the conditions that most closely replicate the region, 25th being 8-island archipelago, tropic jungle there in the Philippines today. And of course, the 11th Airborne Division up in high altitude, mountainous, extreme cold weather in the Arctic. And of course, both of those training areas that we have in Alaska and Hawaii, and then the conditions that exist in those environments, they closely replicate this region of the world. And we have to be able to work in those diverse environments and operate and fight in order to support our allies and partners and our national defense security objectives. So, yeah, thanks for that rundown and giving me an opportunity to talk about that a little bit.
Hey, sir. So we I throw this out sometimes when I'm engaging with audiences, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this without, causing any sort of controversy with anybody. But it seems to me that the other thing that Army forces bring is the ability to create dilemmas. So, it was very fashionable a few years ago to talk about anti-access error denial. Everything was A2, AD. And while we were working on the doctrine, one of the things we were thinking about, and the Marine Corps, I think, tends to think in similar ways at maybe a smaller scale, but from the perspective of a threat like China developing, you talked about their modernization, but they're developing systems to keep the U.S. Joint Force out. And to do that, they tend to really focus on defeating the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy, right? At least you're always seen that way when you would read, the red notes coming out of TRADOC G2 or the Army G2. All of these systems about keeping the Joint Force out, but when they talked about the Joint Force, they're really talking about naval and air forces. And so if you have land forces that are already there in the theater, that they have the ability to both enable air and maritime operations or defeat the threats, air and maritime capabilities, I think you then have created a dilemma that complicates their problem, right? It's no longer a binary issue for them. They now have to look at all domains as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. A couple of things. The A2AD arsenal that they designed was primarily designed, and you just touched on it, to defeat our air and maritime power. And then secondarily, it was designed to degrade, deny, and disrupt our cyber and space capabilities. And those were all areas that we have, amazing global reach and extraordinary capabilities. But the A2AD arsenal that they designed, it was not designed to find, fix, target, and finish distributed, dispersed, mobile, reloadable, mesh networked, lethal and non-lethal land forces. So to the core of your question about dilemmas, what we're doing with the strategic land power network out here and to create our own joint interior lines working with our allies and partners is asymmetrical in nature. I mean, we're presenting a dilemma to them that they did not factor into the design of that arsenal. That is formidable. And I think the important part of this is that we can't do this without the consent and working with the invitation of our allies and partners in the region. And the region is defined by land power. It's defined by the size of the armies in the region. 65% of the Japanese military army, 70% of the Philippine military army, Indonesia, 75%, Thailand, 75%, Vietnam, 80%, India, 80%. I mean, I could go on and on. The point is that these are large armies out here. And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to create, through the build of joint interior lines, which is primarily made up of command and control, protection, collection, and sustainment. What we're trying to create is staying power and operational reach, which gives us positional advantage, Rich. I mean, that's at the end of the day, our central idea out here is positional advantage. And in fact, I just published the Theater Army Strategy that basically the central idea is, as part of a combined joint force, Army forces achieve positional advantage with decisive land power to win the long-term strategic competition and, if called upon, to prevail in war.
No, I think it's great, sir. The operational or the positional advantage piece, I think is powerful, and I think you've given us something to think about in terms of operationalizing that strategic land power network in such a way that people who are, looking at a map, from outer space, they might automatically assume, well, you're talking interior lines. Well, what is it? That's not interior lines. It doesn't look like a Napoleonic version of interior lines or even a World War II version of it. But you're really talking, there's a physical aspect to it, and then there's kind of a human and information aspect to it, right? Because this willingness to fight comes from being with somebody as opposed to driving by them or saying, hey, if something happens, we'll show up. That's a completely different dynamic in a relationship with an ally or partner than we're here with you.
That notion of persistent partnering, and it has a physical element, it has a human element, and it has an information element. Much like the dimensions, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, dimensions. So,
I want to talk more kind of that human dimension and the relationship building. Could you compare or contrast those relationships with allies and partners in the Pacific with what we have in Europe?
There's no NATO construct here in the Pacific. I guess the closest analogy to that would be the strategic land power network that I'm talking about and that Rich mentioned in the beginning. I mean, that's ultimately, what we're trying to do. Now, there are pockets of multilateral organizations, or I should say agreements and cooperation that are forming. AUKUS would be one. Trilats between Australia, U.S., and Japan. Mutual defense treaties. Of course, ASEAN militaries get together and talk, but the security architecture that binds this region together is actually that strategic land power network. And what I mean by that is that land power network, it protects their national sovereignty and it defends their territorial integrity. And those armies are largely what they turn to as a security dilemma is what is confronting them. So, even though there are water cannons being shot at Philippine military forces and Second Thomas Shoal, there are land forces that are involved in being able to conduct reconnaissance in the air and maritime littorals to create a common operating picture so that there's accurate reporting on what's happening, and then the sovereign country that is being violated, their rights are being violated, they can take action to counter it. I would just also tell you, like, the cooperation, the unity, and collective commitment of our allies and partners out here is absolutely critical to a safe, stable, and secure Indo-Pacific, and it's growing. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 2021, there was an exercise called Garuda Shield that was a U.S. Army, Indonesian Army bilateral exercise. 14 countries were at it, and about 8,000 people. Talisman Sabre in Australia in 23 had 15 nations and 30,000 participants. 10 years ago, that was an army-to-army exercise. Yamasakura is an exercise that we have with the Japanese. It's a command post exercise. It's now got a U.S. division. Two U.S. divisions, a U.S. Corps, an Australian division. And there are going to be observers from the Philippines and likely from the Republic of Korea in that exercise this year, along with Marine forces. And of course, the ground component command from the Japanese ground self-defense forces. So those are three examples off the top of my head that where multilateral activities and multinational exercises and operations are increasing. And that has a lot to do with the behavior of the adversaries and the opponents out here, because they're actually helping us keep this network more tightly bound because of the behaviors and irresponsible behaviors that they've been conducting.
Yeah, so you don't have this strong NATO, but because of
The threat.
there is an increased.
Yeah, bad behavior has consequences. And it lends that sense of urgency too, right, sir? I mean, we do have go-to-war treaties with allies there. I mean, you've got, the famous Article 5 with NATO. But when you look elsewhere in the world other than NATO, pretty much everybody else that we've agreed to help defend is in your neighborhood.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned it earlier, Rich, but like this, I think what I want to underscore is really the human dimension here, because the human dimension through persistent partnering, where the partner is a willing participant in it because they view that their security is at risk. And when they view their security at risk, they turn to the United States because we are the security partner of choice. And that allows us to work with our partners to enable, help, and afford them an opportunity to increase their readiness, and then to also test out their concepts and their capabilities and the organizational changes that are occurring in the region, of which there's too numerous to go into in this particular podcast. But I can tell you all the changes that we're going through, a number of these armies and militaries in the region, they are also going through them. The Australian Army is going through a reorganization. The Philippine Army is going through a reorganization. The Japanese Army is going through a reorganization. And those reorganizations, much like ours, when the Army goes through its reorganization, it has implications because of the interdependencies on the joint force. And in this region, it has implications on the interdependencies of the joint force, but also on the combined and multinational forces that we have to operate within every day. So that is, in fact, an area where we have an asymmetrical advantage, because a number of the Army leaders in this region have gone to schools in the U.S. Army through the IMET program, and then they've also been to our combat training centers. And those combat training centers, the combination of the combat training centers and the schools through training and leader development, have had an impact on all of them. And therefore, they turn to us with our new capability of the Joint Pacific Multinational Readiness Center, the first combat training center that the Army has created in nearly 50 years out here in the Pacific. And in fact, the exportable version of that training center is today in Fort Magsaysay, which is a enhanced defense cooperation agreement site in the Philippines on the island of Luzon. And they're training and enabling and affording the opportunity of the Philippine Armed Forces and the Philippine Army to create their own combat training center, much like we did in the 70s and early 80s when we were going through a conceptual, doctrinal, and training reorganization in the U.S. Army. And I think that that's a very, very powerful incentive to bring this network, this strategic land power network together, that, back to the earlier part of the conversation, is an asymmetric advantage, and it is a dilemma for our opponents.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense, sir.
Sir, I would love to talk continuous transformation.
On continuous transformation, I just say, very supportive of what the chief is doing here. I think his idea about being more lean, mobile, lower signatures, increased lethality, pushing cost-effective technologies, innovating with new ideas. We've been doing that here. Early guidance to my force 3 years ago was every exercise is an experiment, and every experiment needs to have an exercise. And I think we live that every day. And I think the innovative, creative, and risk-taking that needs to happen in this theater with new capabilities, new concepts, new technologies actually leads to increasing gains in operational warfighting credibility. And I think that that's very, very powerful.
Gentlemen, any parting thoughts before we wrap up this episode?
The last point I'd make really is, again, back to we just published a new theater army strategy with that central idea that I talked about, the central idea being positional advantage, but it has 4 strategic methods. The first is to organize, and what we mean by that is the most battle-winning mix of capabilities to transform and contact and execute a theater army's missions, roles, and functions. The second method is, we generate, and what we generate is combined and joint warfighting capabilities to prosecute multi-domain operations against our opponents. The third method is the application of land power on key terrain that creates a unity of effort and imposes dilemmas on our adversary, and it empowers our partners simultaneously. And then the fourth method is we are building joint interior lines for warfighting, and that creates that enduring advantage, positional advantage, and staying power for the joint force.
Gentlemen, thanks for the great conversation and being a part of the Breaking Doctrine podcast.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and Rich. Great conversation today.
Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, Breaking Doctrine takes a team. Without the crew and special doctrine division here at CAD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by 29 Pixels Studios. Please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Audible, or Spotify podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.